sort of broader perspective about what insects can tell us about how terrestrial ecosystems are changing under human impact. So, there we go. So I don't know if people remember last summer, well, summer 2021, there was an outbreak of spongy moth, what used to be called gypsy moth in Montreal. Anybody went walking on Mount Royal when there was like no leaves on the trees? Mount Royal or Mont Saint-Bruno or Morgan Arboretum. Does anybody notice this? A couple of people are nodding. So that was just one example of a local insect outbreak. If we just look at some of these headlines, there's been multiple insect outbreaks happening. These are things that happened locally. So there was the spongy moth in 2020, 2021. There had been a forest tent caterpillar outbreak a few years previous to that. Anyone from British Columbia probably remembers the mountain pine beetle that has basically devastated forests throughout the Rocky Mountains. If you were in British Columbia, you'd know. And that outbreak of the mountain pine beetle has clearly been linked to climate change in ways that I will discuss. And then internationally, so this is a phenomenon that's not limited to Canada. So for example, there's been the desert locust that's been outbreaking throughout northern Middle East and East Africa. So on the one hand, we do have these kind of dramatic explosions of huge numbers of insects that are eating everything in their sight and looking pretty catastrophic, making headlines. And then we've also got headlines about an ecological Armageddon of all the insects disappearing. Now, of course, headlines always try and make things look as bad as possible, right? Like they always tell the worst case scenario and everything's awful, but you do seem to have the two opposite extremes. You've both got too many insects and not enough. Another example of this not enough, the insect apocalypse. Now this, of course, is kind of extreme language, but both of these phenomena are actually happening, and they're linked to the way that human beings are transforming the planet. So if we start with a little bit of background, the first thing worth mentioning is that most animal species, so almost 3/4 of all animal species, are insects. So this is just a description of all the known animal species, the ones that are known. The ones that are unknown is a whole other story, and kind of by definition, they're unknown, we don't know. But of known and described animal species, all these different blue colors are different groups of insects. So these are moths and butterflies, these are the ants, bees, wasps, these are the beetles, the true bugs, the flies, all the other insects. So that's almost 3/4 of all the known insect species are some kind of insect. Green here are the arachnids, so spiders, ticks, mites. Are there arthropods? All these kind of pinks are the other invertebrate phyla, so these are the mollusks. Yellow here are the vertebrates, most of them are fish. And then orange here is mammals. So there really aren't that many different kinds of mammals in the world. There's an awful lot of different kinds of insects. So really, if we want to talk about biodiversity, insects are pretty important. They're most of it. So then gets the question of ecosystem services. So ecosystem services is the idea of what does nature do for people. So that would kind of touch on, so what are insects good for? And to me, that's a kind of ridiculous question because insects are so widespread and so abundant, they're completely fundamental to how all terrestrial ecosystems work. So it'd be like saying, you can't say what are insects good for because without insects, we wouldn't know. We wouldn't have the planet as we know it. It wouldn't be life as we know it. A couple of really simple examples that people always come up to because they're maybe easier to understand. One is pollination, and if we didn't have insects to pollinate our crops, there's a lot of foods we would have to do without. And Lawrence Packer, who's like the Canadian expert on bees, argues that this would lead to, mass hunger if we didn't have insects. Another important ecosystem service that people are maybe less likely to think about is decomposition. A lot of decomposing of dead organic matter is done by insects. And then finally, also, I think it's worth mentioning that insects are just really cool. They're different, they're unique. They really challenge us to think that, life isn't necessarily the way that we think about it. We tend to be mammal-centric. Animal life is very different from, us. And practically any sort of weird innovation you can think of, insects do it. Okay, so if we talk about insect outbreaks and climate change, the first outbreak that was ever linked to climate change that got people thinking about this was one of the spruce beetle in Alaska in the 1990s. So the spruce beetle is a beetle that feeds on spruce trees and that feeds on the bark of spruce trees. And usually what it does is it attacks trees that are already kind of dead and weakened and dying. And so, well, what have I done? I pushed the wrong button. I should probably stop pushing buttons now. Okay. So usually what you get is a scenario like this, where you have a live forest, and then you have a few individual trees that were beetle killed. But those were trees that were old and dying anyway. The beetles attack them, they kill them, they die, it makes room for new trees. What happened in the 1990s that was new and hadn't been seen before is that you had mass death of large numbers of trees on the landscape. So all the trees here are dead. They've all been killed by beetles. And so it went from being, part of the ecosystem that just removed the occasional tree to this really, mass destruction. And biologists looked at this to try to figure out what's going on. Why is this happening when it hasn't ever happened before? And they linked it to the fact that there had been 3 very hot years, one after the other, in rapid succession, and that those warm temperatures were favorable to the beetle. You had fewer beetles dying over the winter because the winter was less cold than it usually is. And that's what led to this population explosion. And so already in the 1990s, they were saying, this fluke event of 3 years of very warm temperatures led to this massive beetle outbreak. It led to this insect behaving in a different way than it behaved before. If the climate continues to warm, this might become the new normal. So that was the 1990s. This is the map of where those beetle-killed forests happened in the 1990s. So this is a map of Alaska. That's also a map of Alaska. Most of it was on this Kenai Peninsula here, a little bit farther north. This was the 1990s outbreak. There was another one in 2016, which was long enough for many of those trees to grow back. And you get outbreaking again. In this case, it's happening actually slightly further north than it did in the 1990s. So that suggests that, yeah, this is a new phenomenon. As soon as you get mature trees, you're going to have these mass outbreaks. It's linked to higher temperatures, and it seems to be spreading north. So, as the temperatures get even warmer, it happens farther north than it did before. And that, of course, means a dramatic change for how these forests function. The other example is the mountain pine beetle. Anyone from British Columbia, Alberta? Maybe heard of this? Yeah, so you know this thing. So that's another beetle that feeds on the bark of conifer trees, in this case mostly lodgepole pine, so in the Rockies. Just a little bit of basic beetle biology. These are the adults. So the larva actually feeds on the phloem. So if people remember from plant biology, bark itself is not very nutritious, but phloem is where there are actually some nutrients, and so the phloem is worth eating. So what happens in the life cycle of this insect is that the adults lay their eggs underneath the bark. When the eggs emerge into larvae, the larvae feed on the phloem. If you eat the phloem all the way around a tree, that's called girdling a tree, it means that you can no longer have sap flow. And so you can kill a huge tree by actually eating a very small amount of phloem if you go all the way around the stem. You can do this with a knife. If you take a knife and you cut all the way around a tree stem, you will kill that tree. If you cut deep enough to destroy the phloem and the cambium all the way around. And so that's what these beetle larvae do. And here again, bark beetles are a common part of many boreal forests. They're part of ecosystems. There was the spruce beetle in Alaska. There's the mountain pine beetle in the Rockies. There are other species of bark beetles in Quebec. This is kind of normal. They exist. Trees have defenses against them. So this is an example of how a tree defends itself. You've got a beetle here attacking the tree. The beetle has made a wound in that tree. It's made a little hole in the bark. The tree responds by pitching out all this resin, that gooey stuff that comes out of conifer trees, and the beetle basically gets drowned in it. So healthy trees are able to defend themselves against beetles. And that's why the beetles tend to attack trees that are already weakened, because they have less of this pitching out response. The problem is when it's, one beetle attacking a tree, the tree can defend itself. You've got a tree like this, every single one of these blobs is a beetle being pitched out. So when you have huge numbers of beetles, the tree eventually gets overwhelmed, and then it dies, and then the beetles can have a field day. And mountain pine beetle, similarly to the spruce beetle in Alaska, has in recent years seen, it's maybe been a sort of 10-year period, a huge explosion of its populations, leading to mass mortality of forests. So here too, all of these red trees are beetle killed. This is a map of British Columbia and Alberta. So this here is Vancouver Island. That's the coast. These are the Rockies. And then you've got Calgary here, Edmonton there, and then Vancouver's down here. So the historical range of the mountain pine beetle has always been on the western coast of the Rockies. And there again, it tended to attack, dead and dying beetles, or you'd maybe have, small outbreaks in small areas. What's been happening in the 21st century is this huge expansion of their, killing entire stands and entire landscapes of trees, which of course has a huge impact on the forestry industry and a lot of these communities that rely on the forestry industry. And so MPB here is mountain pine beetle. Where was this forest killing happening in 2002 to 2006? It's the yellow area here. And then over time, they've actually moved farther north, higher up in altitude, up in the mountains. They've actually gotten so high to the mountains that they've been able to cross over to the other side. And you've now got forest killing happening on the other side, on the eastern side of the mountains. And they're gradually spreading eastward through northern Alberta, which gets people very scared because lodgepole pine here are relatively co-evolved with this beetle. They have some defenses. Once you start getting farther east, if they make it into Saskatchewan, Manitoba, then they're getting into jack pine, which has no historical relationship with this beetle, is probably going to be much more vulnerable. And so we don't know how far east they're going to go. But their ability, first of all, to explode at this landscape scale, and then secondly, to move north and also up the mountains, has been linked pretty conclusively to warmer winters. So so with insects, they have very, very high levels of fecundity. So, a female can lay dozens or hundreds of eggs. The only way for your population to stay stable is for most of those to die. With this life cycle, there's quite a lot of death happening in, adults that never find a tree, adults that get killed by a tree, but also larvae that die over winter from cold. They are cold adapted, but only to a certain extent. We've been having warmer winters. We're seeing much less winter death, and that's what's leading to this population explosion. Both population explosion and range expansion to colder places, either farther north or higher up in the mountains. Another example I wanted to mention here is getting a little bit international, so the desert locust. So this is the insect, that's the plague of locusts that are mentioned in the Bible, so this is not anything new. I think that's worth mentioning too, that a lot of insect outbreaks is not necessarily a new phenomenon. So, locust outbreaks have been happening for thousands of years. The Chinese have been recording them, and they've got records for 2,000 years, and yes, occasionally there are outbreaks. You get huge swarms of locusts. This happens in relatively dry desert kind of areas, and it seems to be linked to, you get a good year with lots of rainfall, you get a huge explosion of locusts. They eat all the natural vegetation, and then they start migrating elsewhere. They come in, they eat people's crops, and then eventually it collapses. So this kind of boom and bust cycle is something that's always happened. It's not new. Of course, it's horrific for the people whose crops get eaten, so that's where it becomes a problem, but it's part of how desert ecosystems work. But in recent years, we've seen a kind of similar phenomenon to what happened with those beetles in Alberta, is that we've had 3 years, so from like 2018, 19, and 2020, there's been 3 years of unusual weather, cyclones bringing high areas of rainfall to places that are usually very dry. They're getting that rainfall at just the right time for the locusts. And so we've had explosions of these like mega outbreaks that are larger than they have been historically. And of course, in this part of the world, insects eating people's crops can lead to mass hunger. Because this includes some places, like Yemen, that are not the most politically stable, that don't necessarily have, good infrastructure to support people. They lose their crops, they go hungry. So this has been another, major, I guess, catastrophe linked to insect outbreaks that have been worse than historically expected because of unusual weather. In Canada, the unusual weather is warmer winters. In this case, it's unusual levels of rainfall. Okay, look at some of this theory of insect outbreaks. And this is drawing on a paper by Ken Raffa from about 10 years ago. They're talking about their nonlinear dynamics in insect outbreaks. So nonlinear just means, okay, when something's linear, I guess people know this, right? If it's linear, when, say, the rain increases by 2, the insects will increase by 2. Nonlinear means that you can have a slight increase in rain or a slight increase in temperature leading to, no change, no change, no change in insects, and then all of a sudden, boom, an explosion. So nonlinear means things that can be unpredictable. And what he says here is that there's this this idea of an eruptive threshold. So eruptive here would mean, like outbreaking or exploding. There's a threshold that when that threshold is surpassed, the original features that you needed for the outbreak to happen are no longer needed and the outbreak can continue. So for example, an outbreak starts because of unusually warm temperatures, but once you've passed that threshold, you get like a feedback mechanism kicking in, and you can continue to have outbreaks even if the weather is no longer extremely warm. So for example, so he says here, the spruce beetle and mountain pine beetle outbreaks were released, so they began without unusually warm conditions, but then they kept going even though temperatures were closer to normal. So the years when you had high mortality, you might have had normal temperatures, but that's because you'd gotten beyond that threshold. And that you'd already, once you've started this huge outbreak thing, it just keeps going. And in the case of the bark beetles, that's linked to this idea of mass attack, that a tree can defend itself against 1 or 10 beetles, it can't defend itself against 100. So once you've got zillions of beetles swarming around the landscape, they're going to be hitting, being able to kill healthy trees. And even if reproduction levels and mortality levels are kind of normal, when there's already huge numbers of them, the outbreak can be sustained. So if we get a little bit closer to home, the spruce budworm is something, has anybody ever heard of? So this again is the life cycle. So it's a moth. That's the adult. That's also the adult. That's a pupa. The life stage that we're interested in here is the larva. So the caterpillar, there's one here, there's one. It feeds on the buds of spruce trees. And this one has been outbreaking for maybe the past 10 years on the lower north shore of Quebec. So, Montreal is down here. Quebec City is there. Rimouski is here. This is around Baie-Comeau. So anybody who's got, family or connections on the lower north shore will have heard of this because, along the lower north shore and to a certain extent in Gaspésie, this is a big deal. News hasn't maybe reached Montreal quite to that extent. So this is the level of defoliation that was observed in 2013. So when we say defoliation, it means, maybe I should backtrack here, the spruce budworm feeds on the early developing buds of spruce trees in the spring. So they emerge from diapause early in the spring when those buds start growing. They eat the young foliage as it's growing because that young foliage is more nutritious and less tough than the old foliage. And then as they get bigger, they can sometimes backfeed and go back and eat, the older needles because they can't manage that when they're little, but they can when they're bigger. So how we measure the extent of the outbreak is we measure defoliation. So how many trees are missing their needles and what percentage of trees are missing their needles. And when you're doing it at this scale, it's coarse. It's basically guys driving around in trucks and looking at trees and saying, oh, that one looks like it's missing 50%. Oh, that one's got no leaves at all. That's 100%. And so in 2013, you had, well, basically red is grave, like severe defoliation, around this area here, patches there and there. And this was already of great concern because the last spruce outbreak was in the 1970s. So, we talk about there being a frequency of about once every 40 years. There are still people who remember the 1970s, and we still have data about that. The one before that, we know very little about. But the last outbreak in the 1970s was mostly in New Brunswick. And so this is happening farther north than it did previously. So this is 2013, 2014, very similar. Skip to 2018. So now it's spread throughout, and then 2020. So now we've got spread in Gaspésie, and then going both farther down the North Shore and farther north. And a lot of these green areas that now have light defoliation, in many cases it's because the other trees are dead. So there's not much left to defoliate. So this again is, a large-scale phenomenon that, spruce budworm outbreaks are not new. We knew there was one in the 70s, but this is happening farther north than it did before. And what that means is that the historical ones happened in balsam fir forest. So we have pretty good understanding of what happens to a balsam fir forest when it gets defoliated by the spruce budworm. Basically, the fir die, and then trees that are in the understory grow back and replace it. So they're replaced to a certain extent by fir, but they can also be replaced by spruces. But we know that what happens is a coniferous forest grows back. It takes time, but it happens. Now the outbreak's happening in a black spruce forest. This is a different tree species. It's obviously colder, more marginal, less fertile soils, and we don't really know what's going to happen when this black spruce forest gets killed by spruce budworm. Will it grow back as another black spruce forest? Or there's some modeling that suggests that it'll get transformed in what's called an open canopy shrub heath, which is basically an ecosystem like this with no trees but with very small shrubs. And we don't know. But obviously for the forestry industry, this is much more valuable than this. And, wait another 30 years, we'll get the answer. But that's, And so this leads to the idea of regime shifts. And a regime shift is basically when an ecosystem starts functioning differently and it becomes something else instead. So the frequency, severity, location, and extent of eruptions or insects outbreaks is greater than what happened in the past. So what we can infer from the past. So we have more frequent, more severe outbreaks than we did in the past, or we have outbreaks happening in a different location than in the past. And so that leads to a shift in what kind of ecosystem we have. And this occurs when the resilience of a system, so the resilience is the ability of the ecosystem to bounce back. So, we knew that balsam fir forests were pretty resilient to budworm defoliation because, budworm would come through, they would kill the balsam fir trees, but then there would be an understory that would grow back, and, you give it 20, 30, 40 years, and it grows back as a mixed fir spruce forest. So that system is resilient to budworm. Is the black spruce forest resilient to budworm? We don't know. So these regime shifts occur when the system's resilience is exceeded, and the resilience is the level of disturbance which it can withstand but still continue functioning in the same way. So that's saying this in words. This is kind of a graphical representation. So the idea is that this little ball is the state of your system. And if it's in regime 1, it's here. And if it gets disturbed, it gets moved over here. It gets disturbed, so something happens. There's an insect outbreak. There's a fire. There's a flood. The state of your system changes a bit, but over time it grows back to what it was. So it's resilient to these kinds of disturbances. Because disturbances happen in ecosystems. This is normal. Nothing is ever static, right? You always have, there's a year when there's bad storms, and then maybe there's a flood, and then maybe there's a fire. But as long as your forest grows back to the same kind of forest as it was, it's resilient. It stays within this regime despite some fluctuation. A regime shift is when your disturbance is so bad, is so extreme, that instead of falling back to where it was before, it falls into this new state. And so in the case of the mountain pine beetle, the original state was this lodgepole pine forest. Now we seem to have exceeded this threshold, and it's not, the large parts of the Rockies that are not going to grow back as lodgepole pine forest. They're going to grow back as something else. And what that something else is, we're not altogether sure. Question of the spruce budworm. We have places that were black spruce forest, and the question is, are we shifting into a new regime where they're going to grow back as open canopy shrub heath instead of black spruce forest? And that we're not altogether sure either. But so this is a kind of, I guess, central idea in ecological theory in terms of global change is that if human beings are pushing the parameters of the way the planet works in terms of the climate, but maybe also in terms of how much forest we're cutting down or how many introduced species we're bringing in or how many species are being destroyed, we might be causing regime shifts where a whole ecosystem ceases being this kind of ecosystem and becomes another one. So here's getting that back in words. So triggers of regime shifts are often slowly acting variables. So this is the idea of nonlinear. How do you have a trigger that all of a sudden pushes you from here to here? It can be a slow acting variable. It could be something gradual that gradually builds up and builds up and builds up, such that all of a sudden you hit a threshold and boom, you transform to something very different. And globally rising temperatures is one example of something that's gradual. You increase the temperature by a little bit, nothing changes a little more, nothing changes a little bit more, nothing changes a little bit more, boom, completely different. You get these nonlinear effects of dramatic changes from a gradual acting variable. And then the theory also suggests that it might be very difficult to restore the system to its original state once it's transformed. So if those black spruce forests do regrow as open shrub heath, that might be what we're stuck with. It might not be possible, or it'll be extremely hard to make them go back to black spruce forest. Just another is that we're not going back to the past. Once it's changed, it's changed. Worth mentioning that ecosystem changes have happened in the past. This is not altogether, the first time anything like this has happened. So what this is a paleoecological record from peat bogs in northern. And this blows my mind. The people who do this work, they're amazing. So what it is this is a core of peat that's like 10,000 years old. And you can't really go back more than 10,000 years because that was the ice age when most of Quebec was under ice, so there wasn't really much happening. So they get this core of peat. They then date it using radioisotopes to find out how old each level is. And then people go through this peat with a microscope, and they find pollen of all these different tree species. So in black, you've got the Latin name, and then I put the English name in red. And then they count how much pollen they find of these different tree species at the different levels. And so you can find out, for example, that balsam fir is pretty common now. 3,000 years ago, there was very little of it. Here you had a blip with lots of balsam fir, and then again, in the past, you had lots of balsam fir. White pine is extremely rare in this region now, but through much of this ancient history, white pine was very common. So this is telling you that the ecosystem has changed in the past 10,000 years. It hasn't always been the same, that the trees that are common now were maybe not common in the future. There have been shifts. And then this here, charcoal is indication of forest fires. So forest fires are actually more common now than perhaps they were in the past. And maybe that tells us something about paleoclimates. Spruce budworm scales. So this really blows my mind. People go through these ancient peat and they find individual wing scales, which are these tiny microscopic things. And they're able to identify them as spruce budworm wing scales, and then they can count how many there were. And this indicates that, budworm outbreaks have happened before. This is not a new thing. So ecosystems have changed, but you look at the time scale, we're talking 10,000 years. So this is certainly not, remembered human history. So that kind of covers the sweeping outbreaks part of the talk. The next thing I wanted to look at is these ideas of drastic declines, of insects decreasing. So I think everybody is aware that we are kind of in a biodiversity crisis. So a lot of biodiversity around the world is decreasing. This is a Living Planet report produced by the WWF. This is the 2020 version. The 2022 one has come out recently, but I didn't have the time to check that. And what they have here, this is a kind of biodiversity index that puts together, it's based on vertebrates only. So that's kind of a limitation. You know, they're not counting every single species in the world, but they're counting a number of vertebrate species. They're looking at the distribution, the population size, and then they're calculating this index of how much biodiversity there is. So it's a pretty coarse index. It can be critiqued, but you know, it's pretty much the best one we have for like overall biodiversity. And it's showing you that since 1970, pretty much everywhere, it's been going down. And it's been going down particularly in the tropics, which of course is of concern because the tropics is where there is the most biodiversity, and it's also where there is the most people, and it's also where there are the most vulnerable people. And so the IPBS is the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So people have maybe heard about the IPCC, which was this international group of hundreds of scientists who are trying to measure what's happening with climate change, and they wrote a report. The IPBS is a sister process. So there's hundreds of scientists from all over the world who got together to calculate, you know, what's going on with biodiversity. And what are the implications for ecosystem services to human beings? And their conclusion is that current negative trends in biodiversity and ecosystems undermine progress toward the Sustainable Development Goals. So the Sustainable Development Goals are, again, goals that were put together at the global stage, at the global level in terms of development for people. So the Sustainable Development Goals are things like reducing world poverty, every child getting access to education, every person getting access to clean drinking water, enough nutritious food for everybody. It's these basic kind of human development goals. And what the IPBS report is saying is that our progress towards those goals that have to do with, you know, meeting basic human needs is being undermined by the biodiversity crisis. So to me, that's important because in the past, we made this argument of, oh, well, you know, nature's all very well and good for the rich countries, but feeding people is more important than preserving the hummingbirds or whatever. And what this is saying is no, actually, we can't feed people because we're destroying nature. And if we want to be able to continue feeding people and having people access to clean water and people being safe from, you know, hurricanes and landslides, the best way for that to happen is by preserving nature. A shorter, maybe more poetic way of saying that is that the essential interconnected web of life is getting smaller and increasingly frayed. Okay, so again, most animals are insects. So if biodiversity is going down, clearly insect biodiversity is going down too, just by representation. So the question then is something happening to insects that's different from just overall decline in biodiversity? And then this is an entire issue of a journal from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States from January 2021, which basically brought together entomologists, kind of experts in insect biodiversity to try to answer this question. So are insects declining, you know, is insect decline something different from biodiversity decline? Well, clearly there are individual species of insects that are declining. So I think everybody knows about the monarch. There are 80% fewer monarchs than there were when I was a child, so you can still see them, but they're not anywhere near as many. And that's why the monarch is now an endangered species. Carner blue no longer exists in Canada, but it is still in the United States. It's endangered in the United States. The rusty patch bumblebee, nobody has seen one in Canada since 2009. So we're still looking, but you know, there's less and less hope. But that does still exist in the United States. The Rocky Mountain locust, nobody has seen one since about 1920, so it's gone. But this is only 4 species, and there's almost 1 million species of insects. So, you know, that 4 of them are gone or are declining doesn't really mean much. Fireflies are a group that's been assessed. So you might not know there are 128 species of fireflies across the United States. of all those American species of fireflies, 11% of them are threatened. 11% of them are low enough populations that there's concern that they might be going extinct and they might need protection. 33% are least concern. So least concern means nobody is worried about them. They're abundant, there's enough of them, we don't have to worry. But then 55%, so more than half, are data deficient. And that basically means we don't know. We don't have a clue. Nobody studied them, we don't know enough about them to say. So this concern about overall insect declines came from a study that was done in Germany, which people might have heard of, because this is a really kind of ingenious and different way to work. So this was in a national reserve in a park in Germany, where what they did is they put out traps, they trapped insects, and then they'd get a sample like this, which is a mess of everything that flew into their traps, and they didn't bother identifying them or anything, they just waited. They've been doing this for 27 years, and of course, some years it goes up, some years it goes down, the kind of numbers fluctuate. But if you plot the overall trend in this 27 years, you've seen a huge drop. And that's concerning because this happened in a protected reserve. So it's not because that forest has been destroyed. It's not because anybody's spraying pesticide within this forest. It's clearly the insects within this protected forest are being affected by something happening larger scale around them. And this is what, when this study came out, that's what challenged people. That's what led to these headlines of, the insect Armageddon. But it's also what challenged people in other places to say, well, is this true elsewhere? So you guys have seen this. Obviously, just weighing insects is not the best approach. Is something similar happening elsewhere? And so one elsewhere where insects have been studied for a very long time is the Área de Conservación Guanacaste in Costa Rica, where there's been this very long-term ongoing study counting moths and then working out the life cycle. So finding for each one of these moths, where's its caterpillar, what does the caterpillar feed on, what's the life cycle, and so on. So this is one place where people have been light trapping moths since 1984. Now, light trapping is a really, really easy technique. All you do is you go out at night. Some of you might have done this. Has anybody done light trapping of moths? Yeah. So you put out a sheet at night, you put out some lights, and then you wait. And then moths are attracted to the lights. You can then collect them, photograph them, count them, whatever you want. And then once you turn the lights off, the moths go off and do their own thing. So this is an example of what they got when they did that light trapping. And so that was 1984. This is 2019. And so this, when we talk about the essential interconnected web of the life on Earth getting smaller and frayed, this is kind of what that means. And this gets back to what Canadian fisheries biologist Daniel Pauly calls the idea of a shifting baseline. So shifting baseline is that we're transforming the world, but we don't remember what it was like before. So we don't realize that it's been transformed. And so people aren't upset or angry or anything because they just don't know. So I think if you were to go, to an ecotourism lodge in Costa Rica now, and they did a light trapping, and you saw this, you'd say, wow, this is totally cool. This is much more exciting than what you'd see light trapping in Montreal. This is totally beautiful. That one is too. You've got some really amazing specimens. You'd come back saying, oh, tropical biodiversity, it's amazing. And it's true. This is much more amazing than what you'd see in Canada, and that's the way the tropics are. But you wouldn't know what it was like in 1984, because nobody remembers 1984. So that's the shifting baseline. So are all insect species declining all over the world? This is an attempt to try and bring together all different studies from different places to answer that question. So each dot here is one long-term study where people have been measuring abundance and diversity of some group of insects in some kind of way. The ones that are red are showing population declines. The ones that are blue are showing population increases. And so a first answer, are they all declining all over the world? The clear answer is no, there's, almost as many blue spots there as there are red spots. So there are clearly, some species that are doing very well, whereas others are declining. One thing that's perhaps worth mentioning is that there's an awful lot of studies happening in Europe and the United States, very few elsewhere. And of course, if you want to measure something at the global level, that's kind of a problem, because that's not giving you a representative sample of the whole world. But no, so we can't say that all insects are declining. Clearly, some are doing well. And that tends to be, in general, true about how biodiversity responds to human impact or to change. Some do well, some do very poorly. So if we look at the drivers of insect declines, I mean, again, this comes from that kind of summary article. They pinpoint a whole bunch of drivers. And what's important about understanding the drivers is if we know why biodiversity is changing, then maybe we can do something about it. And so what they highlight as the most important drivers, first one is climate change. So, warming, more intense storms, and more intense droughts. That seems to be what's driving a lot, when these species, so for example, in Costa Rica, they link a lot of these declines in moths to drought. They have 2 rainy seasons. The second rainy season apparently is not happening at the same time as it used to. It's less strong than it used to be. Sometimes it doesn't come at all. This change in rainfall pattern is what they think is probably underlying a lot of that extinction. So climate change is a big one. Another one is deforestation. So you get rid of a forest, then you get rid of the hundreds and thousands of species and insects that live in that forest. And another one is agricultural intensification. So traditional agricultural landscapes that have small fields, hedges, little woodlots, there's a lot of insects that persist in these kinds of landscapes that do both providing food for people and providing habitat for wildlife, including insects. You change that kind of traditional agricultural landscape to a more intense one where you have huge fields, no hedges, no trees, nothing but soy for hundreds of square kilometers. That really nails biodiversity. And so then the last step that they had in this whole journal issue is what can people do about it? And they highlighted a bunch of actions that people can take. I just put them here. So the first set have to do with preserving insect-friendly habitats. So, if you own land, don't keep it as a monoculture of lawn, but try and have, a diversity of different plants that can support insects. So flowers, bushes, trees, whatever. Limit use of exterior lighting. So there's suggestion, particularly in city environments, that moths are attracted to light. Having all this bright light at night disrupts mating patterns. It tends to be bad for populations. And then eating meat doesn't seem to be very intuitive, but a lot of that deforestation and agricultural intensification is driven by producing crops to feed to animals, to feed to people. If people were directly eating the crops, we would need less cropland, and that would mean more land for insects. And then the second set of things that they recommend that people can do has more to be doing, is more linked to acting at the group level. So there's only so far you can get as an individual. But if everybody as an individual is part of a community, and if you can influence that community to move in the right direction, then you can maybe have more influence than you would individually. And that community can mean, it can be at the level of your school, it can be the level of the city, or it can be the level of the province or the country as a whole. So kind of be involved, at that larger level. Another initiative that came out of Costa Rica that I think is really interesting is this idea of bioalpha, so bioalphabetization or bioliteracy. And that is that there are millions of species out there that are still viable, that still exist, they still have healthy populations but if nobody knows anything about them, they're invisible to us. And once people know about them and see them and are aware of them and care about them, then they're much more likely to be protected. And so that's why they talk about being kind to the survivors. So being kind to these surviving species to facilitate the owner society, so the society where they live, to value them as legitimate members of a green, sustainable nation. So if people know about the biodiversity of the place where they live, they're much more likely to care and to want to protect it. So there's a lot of initiatives involved in increasing bioliteracy, and Vanier College has actually been in the forefront of several of them. There's the application iNaturalist that some people might know about, that you can use to both, you yourself take photographs of animals, plants, organisms, whatever, and upload them to a database, but then also use that database to identify something you see. So that's a tool that really allows, ordinary people, like anybody who owns a cell phone and who sees organisms, to participate in biodiversity science, both by educating yourself, but also contributing data. The City Nature Challenge is now something that happens every year, where cities around the world mobilize people to go out to photograph and identify organisms. And then there's this kind of friendly competition between cities. And the city that won last year, perhaps surprisingly, was La Paz in Bolivia. In part because the city is spread over a very large altitude, so it is naturally very biodiverse, but it's also a region where there aren't necessarily very many good field guides or very good tools for people who might want to learn to identify things. And in that context, building an iNaturalist resource is much more useful because you don't have any other tools. The Campus Biodiversity Network is similar to the City Biodiversity Challenge, except here it's actually campuses of universities, CEGEPs, colleges, whatever, who there too compete for getting records of different species on their own campuses. And then next year, last year, you can see that Vanier was the one that won, with almost 2,000 observations of different species on your own campus. So that's something that happens. You've got a couple of professors. I don't know, is Chris Cloutier here? He's one of the people who's very much involved with this. Catherine Cullen too. So, keep your eyes open for this next year because it's still happening. Also at Concordia next week, we do have an event on open access to information on climate justice. And in the context of that event, there is a kiosk on iNaturalist, where we'll have students to teach people how to install iNaturalist on their phone and how to use it, and to show some examples of the ways that people use it. So if you're interested in doing that, you're more than welcome to come. It's next Tuesday at Concordia downtown at 4th Space. So I guess I wanted to just here say that, my own journey into being a scientist and improving my own little bioliteracy has been a lot of fun. It's been very exciting. It's allowed me to do, I guess that, learning about nature and improving bioliteracy and learning about how the real world works has been very exciting, and I enjoy it a lot. I've gotten to do field work in some really nice places. This is in Quebec, internationally as well. So that's in the high altitude desert in northern Chile. You might not see a lot of plants, but we're looking at a plant here. There's another plant there. So there actually are things that survive here. I've also worked in kind of agricultural areas in the tropics in Ecuador. So looking at which insect species, I guess, persist in these kind of disturbed tropical areas, the disturbed more kind of agricultural places, and which ones are only staying in more forest undisturbed kind of places. So the world's an amazing place, and getting to learn its biodiversity has just been a lot of fun. I can't believe they pay me to do this. The other part of this that's a lot of fun is all the dynamic and exciting young people I get to work with. They're always full of energy and new ideas, and they're always stimulating. So these are the people who are working in my lab this summer. One of these is a Vanier student. I don't know if you recognize her. There's someone in there you can maybe recognize. Victoria Yip here. This is maybe not the best photo of her, but can't get everybody smiling at the same time. So she did a CEGEP research internship with me last summer, and she was really excellent. And then this is another group of students who were working on nature education here in Montreal. So doing outreach to teach people about local biodiversity. And then I think, so E.O. Wilson, who died last year, was the person on the world who knew the most about ants. And he was very much an advocate for biodiversity science and conservation. And he says that, in one sense, we know much less about Earth than we do about Mars. Because Mars is pretty simple. There's not much to learn about it. Earth is infinitely more complex in terms of the diversity of life that exists on it. It's estimated that maybe 1/4 of animal species are identified, which means that 3/4 are not. And of course, that's an estimate, because how can we know how much there is that we don't know? We can estimate it, but so we don't actually know that much about the planet that we live on. What this means is that we're flying blind into our future. We're changing the way the planet works, and we don't even know how it works to begin with. So what's that going to do? We don't know. Which he then takes to saying that there can be no purpose more inspiring than to begin the age of restoration, reweaving the wondrous diversity of life that still surrounds us. That what still exists is amazing, and it's just totally cool, and working with this is the most inspiring thing that you can do. At least he's enjoyed it, and I have as well. So I think the final thing I wanted to mention is the Science College at Concordia. So this is completely changing gears, but I'm also principal of the Science College. What the Science College is it's a community, an interdisciplinary community for students in the sciences, where it's a relatively small group, and we're looking for really motivated students who want to kind of go deeper in their studies in science and go broader and to ask questions about the role of science in society and learn about different sciences other than the one that they're studying. And they do this by doing research projects. They have to do 3 research projects throughout their undergraduate career. And also they take courses that go deeper into thinking about what is the role of science and what is science exactly. And they're also it's pretty small group, so it ends up a very tightly knit community where people both support and challenge each other. And really the strength of the college is its students. It is this very dynamic, supportive, interesting kind of environment. If you want to learn about the college, we do have an open house this Saturday. So it's part of Concordia's general open house. There is a Science College presentation in the morning that you're all welcome to come attend. I think if you want to learn more about the college, the best ambassadors are our own students. So come and ask them about their own experience. And the other event that I do want to advertise is next week. We also have a public lecture. So this is one of the annual events that the Science College holds, is these public lectures for the broader public, which means absolutely everybody, you, your parents, your friends, your neighbors, about a topic in science that is of general interest. In this case, it's about social learning and how children learn from others. And that's next Thursday evening. It's hybrid, so you can either come in person to Loyola or you can attend online if that's easier. And I think I'm going to stop there. So thank you very much. And if anybody has any questions, comments.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Despland. I'll open the field to questions. I'll come run with the microphone, I think, probably the best.
Thank you for the presentation. We're talking about the biodiversity. Now, in case of plants, I know there are places where they keep seeds and they could at some point regrow, but what do we do with insects? I mean, do we rely on the biodome and that's it? Or what options are there to get back the biodiversity?
Yeah, so no, there is an argument, I think, more for vertebrates, that zoos and captive breeding can play a very important role. So like Galapagos turtles, there have been turtles that have been reintroduced from turtles that were kept in captivity. So I think zoos play an important role there. Insects, it's a lot harder. You can keep seeds viable in a freezer for years. Insects, not so much. So I don't think the best is to keep them where they are and alive.
So you mentioned the difficulty with that this is a global problem and that there's not a lot of global data. What's being done to kind of bring everybody together. I can imagine it's quite difficult.
It's hard. I mean, there's a lot of global problems with getting people to get along at the global level. I mean, there's a lot of problems with inequality and with our colonial past, and that absolutely shows up on the map. That people do the studies in the United States and in Europe. Why? Because that's where they are and that's where the money is. To what extent does that money from the developed countries in the north maybe flow south to the biodiverse countries? There's limitations. I think that's a problem that goes way beyond science. That's not science. That's kind of the problem with the whole of how our world operates, unfortunately. I think, though, what's changing is that we're more aware of it. So we're more showing this graph, and we're saying this, which I think is helping support collaborations between, richer countries and global south countries to support scientists in those countries to do their own research. So I think we're more aware of it, and we're more making efforts to kind of support those collaborations. But yes, it's hard. The inequalities make it hard, and then there's also questions of war and insecurity that also make it hard.
Hi. So with these regime changes that we're seeing, like you look at the spruce bloodworm, and eventually you could imagine it's going to eat out all of its food supply, and it might end up being one of these species that's on the decline, right? So we kind of say, oh, well, these ones are doing well, these are thriving, these are not thriving. With these regime changes and with these changes in ecosystem, have we observed any speciation as these ecosystems are changing? Do we see new species appearing as a result of these sort of drastic events?
Maybe. So I think one thing that's really mysterious about the budworm is when it's in an outbreak, there's huge numbers, and then, like you said, they eat out all the forests. A part of how the outbreak collapses is that there's no more trees. And then for years between outbreaks, you get females who die unmated because the population is so low that they emit pheromone, they call for males, and nobody comes, and nobody comes, and nobody comes, and then they end up dead. So it's this mystery of how they persist at this very, very low density. But they do. So that's mysterious. New species, I mean, speciation is hard to observe. It doesn't happen very fast. There is one example that's well known that's been studied quite a lot of Regalides palminella, which is a fly that's native to North America that feeds on hawthorn fruits. And then apples got introduced to North America about 500 years ago. So you might not know this, but apples are actually from Central Asia. So they've only been in North America for about 500 years. And there is now a fly that feeds on apples, not on hawthorns. And so it's maybe not altogether a new species, but it's certainly a new subspecies that has arisen because of a new host plant that was brought by people. So that's maybe not entirely an answer to your question. Okay. Yeah, it's the obvious one, yeah. Are there any other ones? I mean, speciation is hard to observe, and it's slow. But it could have, I mean, yeah. Go ahead.
So this is kind of like a two-parter, kind of. So, if there's a lot of animals, like how many animals depend on a lot of these, insects as a source of food? And additionally, how would it affect those animals? And there's no way to control these outbreaks. You have to let them go through their course because, as you said, if you mess with it a little bit, then you can't because it goes on such big up and down. So, how would this affect the vertebrates or the other animals that I guess depend on those as a food source?
Yeah, so that's actually a really interesting question. So I think, like you said, resource managers in both the locust case and the spruce budworm case have realized we can't necessarily stop these because it's too huge and it would be too huge an investment, and we'd be better off maybe compensating people who have economic losses because of the outbreak rather than trying to prevent the outbreak from happening. I mean, in the locust case, that means subsistence farmers who have lost their crops, you somehow need food aid or you need some kind of insurance or something. In the case of the spruce budworm, what they're doing in Quebec now is they're saying we're going to protect stands that have high economic value. So this small forest, we're going to spray insecticide because we're going to harvest it in 3 years. But the rest, like, let it just happen. What does this mean for vertebrates? I mean, clearly when you have these huge numbers of insects on the landscape, yeah, vertebrates eat them. So it's been shown with the spruce budworm that there are a few species of birds that during an outbreak, they lay bigger clutches. So instead of having 2 or 3 chicks, they have like 5 or 6. And so those populations of birds do increase. But then when the spruce budworm outbreak crashes, then the bird populations maybe kind of go down and get back to where they were. Does that? Yeah. But conversely, we also see that overall, a lot of insectivorous birds in agricultural areas, so like swallows. Swallows used to be really common in southern Quebec. They're not anymore. We're not entirely sure why, but part of it is thought to have to do with they live in agricultural areas, there's less insects, and so that's food for them. Is there a student there? Yeah? There's someone over here.
I'll go first.
Okay.
I have the mic. I'm just curious, we're talking about the population of insects moving north, where typically we're expecting colder climate, but they're moving north because of global warming. But I was wondering, is there any kind of contribution to the insects adapting to colder climate? If we put aside the warm temperature that's been measured, I mean, would insects naturally move up norther and because of more food or something like that, they would adapt to colder climate?
So, I mean, the spruce budworm, people have studied the population genetics, and because they're found across Canada. I mean, there's spruce budworm, in New Brunswick, and then there's spruce budworm in the Yukon, and everywhere in between. Well, pretty much everywhere east of the Rockies. And once you get into the Rockies, it's a different story. And they're surprisingly homogeneous. There's very little differentiation in populations, in part because they migrate so much. So because the adults fly, they fly around and you get mixing. But there is nonetheless a small amount of adaptation to temperature. So the ones from the Yukon survive cold temperatures better than the ones from New Brunswick. So it seems at that extreme, there has been some local adaptation. The forest tent caterpillar, which is also an outbreaking insect that has a pan-North American distribution east of the Rockies. The ones from like Georgia feed on plants like water tupelo, which is a tree I've never heard of, but apparently it lives in like North Carolina and South Carolina. So they feed on different host plants, and the ones in the south have smaller eggs, and they're much less resistant to temperature. So if you look at, like geographic patterns that are static, yeah, the ones in Alberta are better adapted to cold than the ones in North Carolina. But that has presumably happened over thousands of years. How much of that change is happening now linked to plants and so on? Maybe, but we do also know that the temperature is changing, so it's hard to disentangle.
Hi, I have a quick question. So when it comes to talking about like invasive species attacking the ecosystem, so looking at the lanternfly in the US or hammerhead worms and whatnot, there's many initiatives that tell citizens to essentially kill on site, in parentheses I'll say, to protect the ecosystem or tree species or, overall soil itself from being affected or losing other species. Now, can something like that be applied to the spruce bloodworms, or is it just like you can't do anything about it, we have to let the outbreak go as is, and human interaction should be restricted?
So, I mean, the budworm in the 1970s, New Brunswick pursued a very aggressive, let's try to kill them. And because we're talking about huge forest areas that are pretty remote, what that meant was, spraying DDT from airplanes. It killed a lot of budworm. It made a lot of people upset because there's not very many cities there, but there are people who have hunting camps and fishing camps, and nobody likes being sprayed with DDT, right? That's extremely dangerous and not very good. But interestingly enough, the outbreak lasted longer in New Brunswick than it did on the island of Cape Breton, which is Nova Scotia, and Nova Scotia did not have this policy. And so this is only one, it's only one data point, but there's some idea that maybe, you know, when you're in an outbreak, the population goes up and up and up. And if you knock it down here, it keeps increasing. And then you knock it down here and it keeps increasing. And it's not possible to knock it down low enough to completely get rid of it. Whereas if you let it run its course, it'll eventually, they'll, you know, eat out all the trees and then they'll die and it'll crash faster. So does that kind of answer your question? Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. Following up on that question, when you do try to cull a certain amount of the population, like bacteria, do you get a selection for those that are more resistant to pesticides and other environmental conditions?
Absolutely, yeah.
That's creating a problem, right?
Yeah, so if, that's actually a very good point. If what you're doing is spraying with insecticide, yeah, you're gonna get resistance because all the ones that are less resistant will die and the ones who survive will be the most resistant. That's a known problem in agricultural pests. So agricultural pests do get sprayed consistently, and yeah, there are, you know, resistant varieties of a lot of agricultural insects. I don't think it's happened in the forest because this spraying is really expensive. So doing it, you know, on a wheat crop or a soy crop is worth it. But, you know, spraying all of New Brunswick with airplanes, like that's hugely expensive.
And if you were to undergo a venture like that where, you know, you sprayed insecticides in a forest, how would that affect the other parts of the ecosystem? Because once again, you can't just do an insecticide that just targets that. You target other insects and then you kill those and then you could cause a giant mass mortality in other insects, which causes a mass mortality in vertebrates, and then the food chain just does a gigantic domino effect.
Yeah, so spraying forests with DDT was done in the 1970s. Nobody does that anymore. It was tried with locust control too, and there's the same problems here. Now they use BTK, which is, I don't know if people are familiar with BT, it's a toxin produced by bacteria. So it's natural, which means it does biodegrade in the environment. It doesn't, you know, persist and bioaccumulate the way insecticides do. And BTK targets Lepidoptera, so butterflies and moths. It gets used, but at a relative, so for example, the city of Toronto and a couple of cities in Montreal, cities in Ontario, have been spraying BTK to control the spongy moth on city trees, because there they made the calculation that, you know, all the trees in the city getting defoliated and then dying is something they don't want to even think about, so they're going to protect those. But yeah, it kills all moths and butterflies, so not only the spongy moth. And there's always this trade-off. But yeah, like widespread spraying of forests is a 1970s thing.
Yeah, so I was just curious because you mentioned how the moths are they spread pretty much everywhere up to the Rockies. With the mountain pine beetles beginning to head across the Rockies, how is it that these two species that both have huge population increase, how are they going to interact, or if that's something that's been considered or thought about?
People have thought about it, we don't have an answer yet. But yeah, if a tree is both getting its phloem hit by beetles and losing half its needles, so conifers are actually pretty resistant to losing their needles. So we've seen this with the spruce budworm. You have trees that look completely dead, but next year they make some new needles. So clearly they've got enough reserves in their roots that they're able to flush out some new needles. If a tree is having to produce all this pitch to get rid of to fight against bark beetles, and it's losing half its needles, so it's not being able to do as much photosynthesis, how will this interact? We don't know, but people are thinking about it. Go ahead.
Okay. Would a good way to control the insect populations be to biodiversify the trees that we have? Because a lot of explosions happen like in specific trees. So if we were to have like different trees, like L'Île du Frein only in,
Despland, yeah. Yeah, so we know that for the budworm, that you have much less mortality in forests that have a mix of conifers and deciduous trees. So yeah, mixed forests are more protected as a general rule. When we don't, but there was a paper that came out really recently saying, we've got like 20 years of experience of how to plant forests to make them more resistant to insects, and we're not doing it. So why not? And a lot of it has to do with economics and various other kinds of policies. Also, maybe when you're talking about big forests, they're not always planted, right? They just grow. Go ahead.
I saw in Florida they were teaching sharks to eat like the lionfish because they're invasive, right? Is there any way we can do that with the beetles? So teach like some sort of predator to eat them?
So things do eat them. There are predators that eat them. There are also parasitoid wasps. So I don't know if insect parasitoids is something people know about. It's another one of those science fiction things. Parasitoid wasps or flies are, we'll say wasps or flies, that lay their eggs inside the body of another insect. And then that larva develops inside the animal and eats it from the inside. And then you get this wasp larva coming out of this half-dead caterpillar that has no more internal organs. So I think it's not so much teaching in that, if there are predators that are able to feed on these things, they do. Vertebrate predators, often the populations can't increase fast enough to keep up. And so often parasitoids are more effective as biocontrol. One possibility is introducing a parasite. If we're talking about an invasive pest, you could introduce one from the native range, but there's concerns with that. But we do see natural learning. I've got, again, this amazing footage of bears eating caterpillars. That when there's this outbreak, you have this huge mass of caterpillars on a tree, and the bear's just coming up and and just swallowing hundreds of them. So, they figured it out on their own. Maybe we just don't have enough bears.
Dr. Despland?
Yes.
Sorry.
No, it's the light. It's not you.
No, that's fine. I was just asking, is there any theoretical possibilities to maybe fight this insect apocalypse, or is nothing being done except studies?
No, there's a lot being done. There's a lot of people who care and who are pushing hard. If one big problem is climate change, I think we understand that climate change is harming a lot of things, and there's a lot of people who are very involved in climate change activism. And there are a lot of scientists being kind of loud and clear about, look, this is what's happening, and this is why climate change is a problem. And this is where the connection is between, the climate and your food source, so things that people care about. When the problems are things like intensification of agriculture or habitat destruction, there too, there are scientists who are being very clear about how this is a problem, but then there's also people who are working with, say, farmers to look at solutions. So this is actually one of the slides that I had, but that I removed. Claire Craman's lab at UBC does a lot of work with farmers to say, how can we change the agricultural landscape in a way that you're still able to produce food and earn a living, but that will also be supportive of biodiversity? And they find that sometimes it's a win-win situation, because once you have, around your field, you have maybe a small little forest, and then you have hedges around your field. Okay, you have fewer square meters of field, but in a lot of those hedges, you'll have beneficial insects, predators. And so if you have predators that are coming into your field and eating the herbivores that are eating your crop, well, you have to spend less on pesticides. Once you have hedges around your field, you also get better water retention, so you have to spend less money on irrigation. So that's one example of somebody who's a scientist who's not only doing studies, but who's actually working with the farmers to change their practices. Because of course, farmers earn their living by this. So if you just tell them, oh, you should change, they're not necessarily going to believe it, because if it doesn't work, they're the ones who ends up in debt. So you have to really work with them to see, well, what are you doing and how are you doing, and let's try this and see if it works. And they often have a lot of knowledge too, so it's really got to be a two-way street in a relationship. Does that answer the question? But yeah, I mean, obviously we should be doing more, right? But
So it's getting a little late. I'm gonna give one last question.
sure.
So I remember I had a boat trip in towards Spirit Island in Jasper Park, and they mentioned how there was there's like an infestation of the beetles there that were killing the trees. However, they also did mention that the trees they were actually they're too old and that they needed to be killed. Is it possible that the outbreaks sometimes or very little times have like a positive effect on the ecology?
Yeah, so that's where you can get to this huge kind of problem that, you know, outbreaks are part of how boreal forests work. They're part of how deserts work. And a certain type of outbreak is one of those perturbations that's within the resilience. So kind of like you said, they kill a lot of the old trees, but when the old trees die, the younger trees can grow up. This can accelerate succession, so maybe it's the fast-growing, like early, like weedy species that die, and then the slow-growing trees that are underneath grow up. And this is part of how it works. When it goes into a new area, that of course is hard for us because, you know, we've been managing this ecosystem, we think how we know how it works, and all of a sudden it doesn't. And it becomes a problem when those trees are economically important to us or culturally important to us. You know, they're dying and they're like, well, something else will eventually grow back, but it might not be something that we can make paper out of. So there's this kind of connection between, you know, human economic needs and how the ecosystem just operates. And to a certain extent, yeah, outbreaks are part of what ecosystems do. But if it means that people go hungry, then maybe we need to do something about that. And if it's happening in a different way than it used to, you know, the ecosystem will be fine. Like if the black spruce forest becomes that open heath, you'll have different animals in there, you'll still have plants, it'll still be an ecosystem, but it's not the one that we're used to.
All right. Thank you again, Dr.
Thank you.
Despland. It was a wonderful talk.
Well, thank you.
Greatly
Always a
appreciated,
pleasure.
and then hopefully we'll see you again maybe next year.
Who knows? Always a pleasure. Thanks.